The gun was already pressed against James Sawyer's chest when Anna Pritchard stepped between them. "Move aside, woman." Harlan Voss did not raise his voice. Men like Harlan never needed to. His voice carried its own particular weight, the kind that had been pressed into service by money and cruelty for so long that it had hardened into something almost physical. He was not a tall man, but he filled a doorway the way a storm fills a valley, and every ranch hand on the Sawyer property had already backed away into the afternoon shadows. Anna did not move. She had ridden 11 miles in July heat to reach this moment, and her dress was dark with sweat at the back, and her hair had come half loose from its pins somewhere around the creek crossing, and none of that mattered at all. What mattered was the look on James Sawyer's face when she had crested the ridge and seen the Voss riders in the yard. What mattered was the set of his jaw, which she had come to know as intimately as she knew the sound of wind in the pines. That jaw said he would rather die where he stood than take one step backward. "Mr. Voss," she said, and her voice came out steadier than she felt, "you are about to make the kind of mistake that does not wash off." Voss looked at her with something between contempt and curiosity. "The school teacher," he said. He turned to the man beside him, a thick-necked foreman named Doyle, and smiled without warmth. "The school teacher thinks she has a say." "She has every say," James said from behind her, and his hand came up and rested on her shoulder, and Anna felt the tremor running through him. Not fear. She knew it was not fear. She had learned the difference in the 3 months since she had arrived in Caldwell Crossing. That tremor was fury held on a very short chain, and it scared her more than Voss's gun. "Last chance, Sawyer." Voss lowered the weapon because a dead man could not sign papers, and everyone in that yard understood that. "The rail company is offering 3 times market value. You sign today, I stop coming. You keep playing the stubborn fool, I keep coming. And eventually something on this property catches fire." The word betrayal moved through Anna's mind like a cold current, because she had heard something that morning, something Voss did not know she had heard, something that changed the shape of everything. And she had ridden 11 miles to say it before the moment became irreversible. "James," she said quietly, turning just enough that only he could hear, "I know about the water." She felt the hand on her shoulder go still. "I know why your father never sold," she said, "and I know what Voss actually wants, and it is not the land." The yard went silent in a way that felt almost sacred. The horses shifted and blew. Somewhere out beyond the fence a meadowlark called once and went quiet. James Sawyer looked at her, and for the first time since she had known him, his eyes showed something unguarded and wide open, something that looked very much like a man who had been carrying a secret alone for so long that the arrival of another person beside him in the dark was almost more than he could stand. "Tell me," he said, and that was where everything truly began. Anna Pritchard had come to Caldwell Crossing, New Mexico Territory, in the spring of 1882, not by accident and not by romance, but by the particular desperation of a woman who had run out of other options and was too proud to admit it. She had been a school teacher in Abilene, Kansas. Before the school board there had replaced her with a man who was, they explained with great delicacy, better suited to the position. She was 24 years old, educated beyond what most considered appropriate for her sex, and possessed of opinions she had never quite learned to keep to herself. These qualities had made her difficult to employ in the East and had, somewhat ironically, made her exactly what the small and struggling community of Caldwell Crossing required. The town had exactly 43 permanent residents, a general store run by a widow named Mrs. Polly Crane, a church without a minister, a saloon that doubled as a post office, and a one-room schoolhouse with 12 children ranging in age from 5 to 14 who had not had a teacher in 2 years. The letter from the town's informal committee had reached Anna through a series of forwarded correspondences that felt almost like fate, though Anna did not generally believe in fate. She believed in logistics and necessity, which amounted to the same thing at the end of a long day. She had arrived on the stage from Santa Fe on an afternoon when the light was so golden and so absolute that it hurt her eyes and made everything look slightly impossible, as if she had stepped into a painting someone had not quite finished. The landscape was nothing like Kansas. It was red and amber and bone white, and the mountains in the distance were the color of bruises, and the sky was a blue so deep it seemed almost to vibrate. Mrs. Crane had met her at the stage stop, a brisk woman in her 50s with a handshake like a carpenter's and eyes that missed nothing. She had given Anna a room above the store, a key, and 3 sentences of orientation. The schoolhouse was at the north end of Main Street. Supplies were limited, and she was not, under any circumstances, to accept an invitation to supper from Harlan Voss. Anna had not asked why, because the way Mrs. Crane said it made the why entirely self-evident. She had started teaching the following Monday, and the children were wild and wonderful and desperately hungry for learning in the way that children are when nobody has paid them sufficient attention, and she fell in love with the work immediately in that bone-deep way she always had. She stayed late arranging the classroom. She rose early planning lessons. She walked the dusty Main Street in the evenings, learning the shape of the town the way you learn the layout of a new house, slowly and by feel. She had seen James Sawyer for the first time on her 4th day. He had come into the general store for rope and salt, and she had been buying ink for the schoolroom, and they had stood in proximity at the counter for perhaps 90 seconds without speaking. He was tall, dark-haired, somewhere in his late 20s, with the kind of face that sunlight had been working on for years, and his hands were the hands of a man who used them for everything necessary and nothing ornamental. He was not handsome in any conventional sense, meaning his features were too rough, his jaw too strong, his eyes too direct. But there was something in the way he occupied space, something quietly certain that made you aware of him the way you become aware of a fire in a cold room. He had looked at her once, nodded, and left. Mrs. Crane, who had observed this entire transaction from behind the counter, had said nothing, but she had watched Anna in a way that suggested she was cataloging a reaction. "Who was that?" Anna had asked with great effort toward casualness. "James Sawyer," Mrs. Crane had said. "His father built the first proper ranch in this valley back in '62. Came here from Missouri, cleared the land himself, ran cattle, died 3 winters ago." She had paused, weighing something. "James has been running it alone since. Harlan Voss has been trying to buy it since before the old man was cold. And James won't sell. James," Mrs. Crane had said, with the tone of a woman quoting scripture, "would sooner stop breathing." Anna had thought about this on the walk back to the schoolhouse. She had thought about a man who would not sell his father's land, and she had understood something about it instinctively, the same way she understood certain passages of literature that other people found difficult. There was a kind of loyalty that did not submit to logic or profit, and she recognized it because she had carried her own version of it her whole life. Her mother had been a woman who believed in standing in place, and Anna had inherited both the tendency and the trouble that came with it. She had not spoken to James Sawyer for another 2 weeks. The occasion, when it came, was not romantic. One of her students, a 9-year-old named Eli whose father worked a small claim east of town, had gone missing after school, and the search had extended into the evening. And by the time Anna had joined the group of adults fanning out across the scrubland, the sky was a spectacular and terrifying orange and fading fast. She had gone west along the creek bed because nobody else had, and she had found Eli sitting on a flat rock with his feet in the water, crying very quietly over a dead lizard he had found and apparently felt tremendous sorrow about. She had been comforting the boy and preparing to carry him back when James Sawyer had appeared out of the dusk with a lantern, because he had seen where the search was missing a spoke and had filled it without being asked to. "Found him," Anna had said, slightly unnecessarily. "So I see." James had looked at the boy, then at the lizard, and his face had done something she had not expected. It had softened. He had crouched down and examined the small creature with what appeared to be genuine respect. "What kind is it?" he had asked Eli. I don't know, Eli had said, still sniffling. Collared lizard, James had said. Your father might know. They're good to have around. Eat the grasshoppers. Eli had stopped crying with the efficiency of a child who has been given something new to think about. On the walk back, with Eli between them and the lantern swinging, James had not made conversation in any formal sense. He had answered her questions when she asked them, direct and without elaboration. He had asked one of his own, whether she had ridden before, because the search had been on horseback for part of it and he had noticed she had stayed on the ground. Not well, she had admitted. The territory doesn't respect that distinction, he had said. It was not unkind. It was simply accurate. She had decided in that moment to learn to ride. It had been Mrs. Crane who arranged it, because Mrs. Crane arranged most things in Caldwell, crossing through a network of quiet suggestions and carefully placed words. Within a week, Anna was going to the Sawyer ranch on Saturday mornings to learn to ride from the man himself, and nobody had commented on this overtly, which meant everyone had noticed and was commenting extensively behind closed doors. The riding lessons had been the beginning of everything and the beginning of nothing, simultaneously, because James Sawyer was the most carefully guarded person Anna had ever encountered, and she had grown up around New England Reserve, which she had previously believed to be the gold standard of emotional concealment. He taught her well. He was patient in a particular way, the patience of a man who has learned that most things require more time than you want to give them. He corrected without condescending. He explained once, and then expected her to remember. When she fell, which she did twice in the first week, he helped her up without the kind of elaborate concern that would have embarrassed her, just a steady hand and a neutral expression, and then back to it. What he did not do was tell her anything about himself. She learned the land first, because the land was what he would talk about. He spoke about this valley in the way some men speak about family, with a particular intimacy and a particular worry. He knew every water source, every soil type, every seasonal behavior of the creek that ran along the eastern boundary. He knew where the grass came in thick in spring and where the cattle should be driven in summer and where the low ground was treacherous after rain. You know this land the way you'd know a person, Anna had said one morning, watching him read the ground the way she read a page of text, fluently and fast. He had looked at her with an expression she could not immediately classify. I grew up knowing it that way, he said. My father taught me. It was the first time he had mentioned his father directly, and something in his voice when he said it made her go very still, the way you go still when a bird lands near you and you do not want to frighten it away. He sounds like he was a remarkable man, she said carefully. James had been silent for a long moment, looking out across the grazing land, and the morning light was doing extraordinary things to the landscape, turning the grasses silver and amber, and she had waited. He came here with nothing, James had finally said. When Missouri got too dangerous after the war, he had $40 and a horse and a letter of land grant from the territorial government. He built the barn first, before the house. He said a man should take care of his animals and then himself. He paused. He was right about most things. The war was hard on Missouri, Anna said, because she knew her history, and Missouri had been a particular kind of brutal during and after the conflict. Harder on some families than others, James said, and she heard the shape of something behind those words, a hidden past that had carved channels into him the way water carves channels in stone, invisible from the surface but determining everything about how things flowed. She did not push. She had learned already that pushing James Sawyer produced nothing but a polite wall. You had to wait for him. You had to be patient in a way she had not always been patient before, and she found, somewhat to her surprise, that she did not mind the waiting, that she had become genuinely curious about him in a way that was different from the curiosity she felt about most people, deeper and more personal, the kind of curiosity that keeps you awake at night, not with frustration, but with a quiet urgency. The spring turned to early summer, and the riding lessons had long since become something else, something neither of them had named because Naming it would have required a conversation they had not yet found the edges of. She came to the ranch on Saturdays and sometimes on Wednesday evenings, and they rode the perimeter of the property together. And he showed her things she would not have seen without him. The eagle nest high in the canyon wall, the spring that came up cold and clear from between two red rocks, the old campsite at the northwest corner where his father had spent the first winter in a tent before the house was built. At that campsite, which was now just a clearing with a circle of old stones still holding the shape of a fire ring, he had stood for a long time without speaking, and Anna had stood beside him in the silence, and she had understood without being told that this was a place of significant weight. "He used to bring me here," James said at last. "When I was young, he'd tell me how it was that first winter, the cold, the wolves, the neighbors who came from across the valley to help with the building." He looked down at the fire ring. He said the land carried the memory of everything that happened on it, that you could feel it if you knew how to listen. Anna had looked at him then, really looked at him, and she felt something shift in her chest in a way that was almost frightening in its clarity, because she understood that this was not merely a man who had inherited property. This was a man who had inherited a story, and the story was inseparable from the soil, and selling the land would have meant selling the story, and some stories are not for sale at any price. "I understand," she said. He turned and looked at her, and something moved in his eyes, something that recognized her. "Do you?" "My mother had a garden," she said, "in Connecticut. She planted it the year she married my father. Every spring she put in the same things in the same places, and every fall she prepared it for winter the same way. When she died, they sold the house, and the people who bought it paved over the garden to put in a carriage path." She stopped. "I have not been back since." James was very still, watching her. "That's not the same thing," he said, but gently, in a way that meant he knew it was. "It's the same kind of thing," she said. "The grief of watching something replaced by something that doesn't understand what it replaced." He was quiet for a long time. Then he said, "Yes," in a voice she had not heard from him before, low and unguarded, and that one syllable cost him something. She could feel it, and she held it carefully. The summer came on hard and dry, and Harlan Voss began appearing at the edges of things. He was not a crude man in his methods, which made him more dangerous than a crude man would have been. He sent letters with official language, referencing the Atchison, Topeka, and Santa Fe Railway, and the anticipated route of expansion, and the various legal frameworks under which land acquisition could occur. He sent his foreman Doyle to have conversations in the saloon that were constructed to circulate, conversations about market values and the wisdom of holding property in uncertain economic conditions. He came himself, twice, to the Sawyer ranch. Both times James had listened to the offer with a flat expression and declined without raising his voice. Both times Voss had smiled and said there was no hurry, and left in a way that made clear there was, in fact, a great deal of hurry. Anna heard about these visits from Mrs. Crane, who heard about them from sources Anna could never quite identify, because Mrs. Crane was the kind of woman who simply knew things about her town the way your tongue knows every tooth in your mouth. "What does Voss actually want the land for?" Anna asked one evening, when she and Mrs. Crane were sitting on the porch of the store in the last of the daylight, and the air smelled of dust and sage and the distant promise of rain. Mrs. Crane had looked at her for a moment. "The railway route is one thing," she said, "but there are men in Santa Fe who are interested in that land for other reasons." "Mineral reasons." "What kind of minerals?" "The kind the railway needs for water," Mrs. Crane said, and she said it in a way that implied she was choosing her words carefully. "There are surveyors' reports filed in the territorial office, not public but not impossible to find if you know where to look and have reasons to look." Anna sat with this. "James doesn't know. His father may have known," Mrs. Crane said. "Thomas Sawyer was not a simple man. He chose that particular piece of land very carefully, and for reasons he kept mostly to himself." She rocked gently. "But whatever he knew, he didn't write it down anywhere James has found." Anna thought about this through the night, and in the morning she thought about it more. And by afternoon she had walked to the small territorial land office, which was also the county clerk's office, which was also the room where Judge Metcalf, who was visiting from Santa Fe every third month, conducted his business. The clerk was a young man named Samuel Bates who had aspirations toward legal practice and found Anna's interest in the survey records both flattering and professionally justifiable. It took 3 visits and one small, careful deception, in which she implied she was researching water rights for an article for the Albuquerque newspaper, to get access to what she needed. What she found, in a folder marked with a code she had to cross-reference against a registry index, was a report from a geological survey conducted in 1879 by an engineer named Harrington on behalf of interests she could not immediately identify. The report described, in the dry language of technical assessment, an underground water system of considerable size and consistency beneath the valley. The water was high quality, cold, and reliable. For a railway operating in arid territory, this was not merely useful. It was, as Harrington's report rather dramatically concluded, essential for the viability of the entire southwestern expansion. The report identified the primary access point as a spring on private property, the spring that came up cold and clear between 2 red rocks on the Sawyer land. The spring James had shown her, the one his father had known about, the one that Anna now understood had been the reason Thomas Sawyer had chosen this particular valley, and this particular claim from among the options available to him in 1862. A man who had come from Missouri with $40 and a horse and a territorial land grant had known something that railway surveyors were only now formally documenting. Thomas Sawyer had built his life on a secret. And the secret was why Harlan Voss, backed by men in Santa Fe who were connected to men in Kansas City and beyond, would not stop coming. And James Sawyer, who did not know the full extent of what his father had understood, was holding that land through pure instinct and inherited loyalty, refusing to sell something he could not entirely explain his reasons for keeping, doing it on faith and grief, and the sound of his father's voice at a winter campsite 20 years ago. She had ridden 11 miles the next morning to tell him, before Voss could act on what was clearly an accelerating timeline. And she had arrived to find Voss already there, and the gun already out, and James already positioned in the center of his yard with the flat expression of a man who has decided to become immovable. In the days that followed, James did not sleep. Anna could see it when she came to the ranch on the morning after the confrontation with Voss, when he was already in the yard at a time that suggested he had been there since long before sunrise, working with a focused intensity that was indistinguishable from his normal manner but was, she had learned to recognize, a form of controlled panic. She had told him everything the evening before, after Voss had gone. She had spread the information out carefully, the survey, the water system, the spring, the men in Santa Fe, and she had watched his face as he processed it. He had not interrupted. He had not reacted in the large, visible ways people react in dramatic moments. He had listened with his whole self, the way he always did, with that complete and serious attention that she had come to find more intimate than most people's most expressive moments. When she finished, he had been quiet for a very long time. "My father knew," he said finally. "It was not a question. I believe he did," she said. "I think he chose this land knowing. He never told me." "Maybe he wanted you to hold the land on your own terms first," she said, "so that if you ever had to defend it, you'd defend it from love, not strategy." James had looked at her across the kitchen table, and the lamp was low and the night was pressing in from all sides, and she saw something in him that broke her heart a little with its vulnerability, because James Sawyer was not a man who permitted himself to be vulnerable, and the cost of allowing it now was visible in every line of his face. "He used to say the land would take care of us if we took care of it," he said. "He was right," she said, "just in a way neither of you fully expected." He had stood then and walked to the window and stood there for a long time, and she sat at the table and let him have the space, because that was what he needed, and she understood his needs now with a clarity that had grown up between them slowly and without announcement. After a while he said, without turning, "Why did you ride out here? Why didn't you send word?" "Because word can be intercepted," she said, "and because I needed to see your face when I told you." She paused. "And because Voss was going to move today. I knew it." "How did you know?" "Because Samuel Bates told me that someone had requested copies of those survey documents on Monday morning. I don't know who, but I know it wasn't a coincidence. Voss has someone in that office." James turned from the window then, and he looked at her in a way that was entirely different from any way he had looked at her before. She had catalogued all his expressions over these months, the careful neutral, the rare approval, the distracted focus on the land, the unguarded moment at the campsite. This was none of those. This was a man who was seeing her completely and letting her see that he was seeing her, and it lasted only a few seconds before he looked away, but she felt it through her whole chest like a struck bell. "You should not be involved in this," he said. "Voss is not a man who makes idle threats." "I know that," she said. "If he believes you know what you know, he may make things difficult for you." "I know that too. Anna," he used her first name, which he rarely did. "This is not your fight." She looked at him steadily. "You are going to need help," she said. "You need legal advice, and you need documentation, and you need someone who can go to the territorial office in Santa Fe without arousing the same suspicions a ranch owner would arouse." "I can do all of those things." "Why would you?" She held his gaze. "Because it's the right thing to do," she said, "and because I want to." The honesty of the second reason sat between them in the lamplight, not quite said completely but not taken back either, and James Sawyer stood very still with it for a moment. And then he nodded, which was his form of acceptance of many things, and they began making a plan. The plan required letters, carefully worded, to the Territorial Attorney General in Santa Fe. Anna drafted them in the schoolhouse after the children left each day, sitting at her desk with the last light coming through the single window and the smell of chalk and pine and the distant cattle. She was a gifted writer, precise and persuasive, and she had grown up watching her father write legal arguments because her father had been a county solicitor before his death, and she had absorbed the architecture of a compelling document the way she had absorbed everything, thoroughly, and without quite noticing she was doing it. She wrote about the water rights. She wrote about the public interest in ensuring that essential natural resources were not acquired through private coercion. She wrote about the survey documents and the irregularity of their restricted access. She was careful to protect her source, phrasing things in ways that could not easily be traced back to Samuel Bates, who had already gone pale with retrospective anxiety about what he had permitted her to see. James, meanwhile, had gone to see Judge Metcalf, who was in Caldwell Crossing for his quarterly visit. Metcalf was a cautious man, a political man, but he was also, Anna had assessed on the one occasion she had met him at Mrs. Crane's dinner table, an honest one beneath the caution. James laid out the situation plainly. He did not embellish. He asked for a formal injunction against any coercive action by Voss or his associates while the matter of the water rights was being examined. Metcalf had listened and said he would need more documentation. Anna had more documentation 2 days later. What she had not anticipated was that Voss would move faster than either of them expected. Voss, who had someone in the land office and possibly someone near Metcalf's chambers as well, had heard enough to understand that the situation was changing. And he had responded in the way powerful men respond when they feel a situation moving out of their control, which is to apply the most direct pressure available. The pressure he applied was, in this instance, fire. Not to the house. He was too careful for that. But to the hay store, the large outbuilding where James kept the winter feed, which represented not only significant monetary value, but the survival of the cattle through the coming cold. It happened on a Thursday night, and Anna saw the glow of it from her window above the general store. that particular orange pulse against a night sky that every person in the West recognized with a cold and specific dread. By the time she reached the ranch, half the town had come ahead of her. The bucket lines were already running, pulling from the creek, and there was nothing to save of the hay store itself, but they were trying to keep the fire from the house and the barn. James was in the bucket line, working without a word, and his face in the firelight was something she did not want to look at directly because the grief on it felt private and enormous. They saved the house and the barn. They lost everything else, and in the morning the yard smelled of ash and the cattle were restless, and James stood at the edge of what remained of the outbuilding and looked at it for a long time. Anna brought food from Mrs. Crane's kitchen. She did not bring comfort in the form of words, because she had understood by now that James Sawyer did not receive comfort well in its spoken form, and that what he needed in this moment was evidence of steadiness, evidence that the world was still navigable, and that people would continue to do practical and useful things. He ate what she brought without comment. His hands were burned on the palms, not badly, but enough that she had cleaned and dressed them the night before over his stated objection that they were fine. They were not fine, and she had said so, and he had held still and let her work. Mrs. Crane had appeared mid-morning with two of her regular suppliers, men who kept extra stock, and between them they had arranged a loan of hay sufficient to last through fall if managed carefully. Mrs. Crane handled the negotiation herself, briskly and without sentimentality, and James had thanked her in a quiet way that she accepted with an equal quietness. After Mrs. Crane left, James sat on the fence rail and looked at the ruins. Anna sat beside him. The space between them on the rail was approximately 2 feet, and felt charged in a way she had become accustomed to, a pressure between them that neither of them had addressed or resolved. "This is his move," James said. "Voss wants me to calculate what comes next and decide it's not worth it." "Is it working?" she asked, not meaning it as a challenge, meaning it as a genuine question. He was quiet for a moment. "No," he said, "it's doing the opposite." He looked at her. "My father built this place from nothing. He built it against worse odds than this. He was not a man who walked away from something because it got difficult." "Then neither are you," she said. He looked at her for a moment, and then he looked away, and she saw his jaw working slightly, that private processing that meant something had struck deep. "You said something when you came into the yard yesterday," he said, "when Voss had the gun. You said you knew about the water." "Yes." "You stepped between him and me." "Yes." "That was a significant risk." "Yes," she said again, and her voice was even. He looked at her directly. "Why?" She met his gaze. "Because I could not stand there and watch something happen to you," she said, "and because I had something to say that could stop it." "The first part," he said carefully, slowly, like a man choosing each word with his whole attention. "The not being able to stand and watch. Was that general concern or something more specific?" Her heart was performing something complicated in her chest. "Something more specific," she said. He was quiet again, but it was a different kind of quiet, a fuller one, the kind that happens when a room has been added to a house. He looked out at the ruined outbuilding and then at the pasture and then at the mountains in the distance. She waited. "I have not been particularly easy to know," he said at last. "No," she agreed, "but you are worth the effort." He made a small sound that might, under other circumstances, have been a laugh. "You are the most direct person I have ever met," he said. "I was told this is a flaw." "It is not a flaw," he said. He was still looking at the mountains. "I built a wall when my father died. I know I did it. I could feel it going up and I did not stop it because I needed it." He paused. "I have been aware for some time now that it has begun to come down." She did not speak. "You did that," he said, "without trying, or possibly while trying. I cannot entirely tell with you." "Sometimes both at once," she admitted. He turned and looked at her then, and she looked back, and the thing between them that had been pressurized and unnamed for months made itself known between their eyes in a way that was so clear and simple and enormous that she felt her breath go. "I am going to fight for this land," he said. "And it is going to be complicated and possibly dangerous, and I am going to ask you not to be involved in any more of the dangerous parts." "You can ask," she said. "I know I cannot require it," he said, "which is one of the things that makes you exactly as alarming as you are." "Alarming," she said. "In the best possible sense," he said, and something in his expression shifted, and she saw the corner of his mouth move in a way she had been waiting, without knowing it, to see. She reached over the 2 feet of fence rail and put her hand on his, the undamaged part above the bandage, and he looked down at it, and then he turned his hand over and held hers, and that was all, just that, but it was more than enough, and they sat there in the smell of ash and the morning light, with the cattle moving slowly in the pasture and the mountains blue and steady in the distance. The legal process moved with the peculiar rhythm of frontier justice, which was sometimes very fast and sometimes glacially slow and entirely unpredictable in between. Anna's letters had reached the Territorial Attorney General's office in Santa Fe, and within a week there was a response that was careful in its wording but indicated genuine interest in the situation, particularly regarding the public water rights question, which was a matter the territory had strong incentive to address before it became a precedent. Judge Metcalf, armed with the documentation Anna had compiled and the additional depositions he had taken from James and from 2 other ranchers in the valley who had received similar pressure from Voss, issued a temporary injunction against any coercive land acquisition activity. It was not a final resolution, but it was formal legal protection, and it changed the character of what Voss could do openly. Voss did not attend any of these proceedings. He sent a lawyer from Albuquerque, a sleek man named Whitfield, who used a great many words to say very little and seemed entirely untroubled by the specifics. But Doyle, the foreman, was seen in town less frequently, and the visits to Sawyer land stopped, and the immediate pressure eased in the way pressure eases when it is forced to find a different shape. Anna knew this was not the end. She said so to James one evening when they were riding the west boundary together in the long summer twilight. "Voss will not abandon this," she said. "He will find a different approach." "I know," James said. He was relaxed on horseback in the way he was relaxed in very few other contexts, the horse an extension of him, his whole body moving in that unconscious, easy rhythm. "But he cannot find a legal approach that works if we keep the documentation properly filed and the water rights question in front of the right people. We need someone in Santa Fe," she said. "Someone who can represent your interests there directly. The Territorial Attorney General is sympathetic, but sympathetic is not the same as committed." James glanced at her. "You know someone?" "I know of someone," she said. "A lawyer named Hargrove who has made a practice of exactly these kinds of cases: water rights, mineral rights, land protection. He argued a case before the Territorial Supreme Court 2 years ago that I read about in the Albuquerque Journal." "You read the Albuquerque Journal?" "I read everything that comes through the general store," she said. "Mrs. Crane is a woman of broad interests." He made that almost laugh sound again, and this time it was a real one, low and warm, and she felt it in her chest the way you feel a musical note that is exactly right. They had written to Hargrove, and Hargrove had come, and he had turned out to be a brisk, bespectacled man in his 50s, who reminded Anna powerfully of her father, which made her trust him immediately, and also made her want to be careful about whether the trust was earned or inherited from resemblance. It turned out to be both. Hargrove reviewed everything, asked sharp questions, identified 2 additional pieces of documentation Anna had not found, and gave it as his opinion that the water rights claim was solid, and the public interest argument was even more solid, and that Voss and his backers in Santa Fe were overexposed, meaning that the men financing Voss's operation had done so under the assumption that the land would be acquired quietly and quickly, and the longer it was not, the more uncomfortable their exposure became. "These are men who do not like discomfort," Hargrove said, over a supper that Anna and James had cooked together in the Sawyer kitchen, which was the first time they had cooked together and produced a meal that was competent rather than exceptional, but was consumed with a pleasure that had nothing to do with the food. "Are they likely to escalate before they retreat?" James asked. "In my experience," Hargrove said, spreading butter on his bread with the precision of a man who is very particular about small things, "men who have invested heavily in a position usually try one more thing before they accept a loss. The question is what the one more thing will be." The one more thing turned out to be Samuel Bates. Anna discovered it on a Monday morning when she arrived at the land office for what she had told Samuel was a final review of some documents before Hargrove filed the formal water rights petition. Samuel was not there. In his place was a man Anna had not seen before, middle-aged, wearing city clothes inappropriate for the territory, who informed her that Mr. Bates was on personal leave and that the records she was requesting had been temporarily relocated during an administrative review. She walked directly to the telegraph office and sent a message to Hargrove. Then she went to find James. She found him in the north pasture mending fence, and she came to him on horseback at a pace that told him before she spoke that something was wrong. "They've moved the records," she said, "and Bates is gone." James was very still for a moment with the fence wire in his hands. "Hargrove," he asked, "already sent for? Can they invalidate what we've already submitted?" "No," she said. "Hargrove filed certified copies. What they've done is try to remove the originals, which might raise questions about authenticity if this goes to formal hearing, and eliminate the person who permitted access to them in the first place." "Where is Bates?" "I don't know yet." She looked at him. "I'm worried for him." James dropped the wire and walked to his horse. "Then we find him." Samuel Bates was found the following day, not through dramatic means, but through the methodical asking of questions by people who knew the territory, which was ultimately more effective than drama. He was at his sister's house in a small settlement called Oro Blanco, 15 miles south, where he had gone, as he explained to James and Anna in a voice that shook only slightly. After two men he had never seen before had come to his residence 3 nights ago, and explained to him clearly what would happen to his career, his position, and his personal safety if he remained in Caldwell Crossing. He was 26 years old and frightened, and he had been doing his best, and he had made one decision out of loneliness and a desire to be helpful that had turned into something much larger than he had understood. Anna sat with him at his sister's kitchen table and said, "You did not do anything wrong in showing me those records. What they have done since is wrong, and we need you to say that officially to the Attorney General's office. Can you do that?" Samuel looked at his hands. "If I do, those men come back. If you do, those men lose the leverage they have to send them," she said. "That's how this works. The only way you are safe is if Voss's operation is fully exposed. A half exposure is the most dangerous thing for you." He looked up at her, and then at James, who was standing near the door with his arms folded and his expression, which was, Anna had learned, his version of support. Not warm in any demonstrative way, but solid and present and entirely reliable. "I'll be here," James said, meaning at least that and possibly more. Samuel Bates signed a deposition before Hargrove that afternoon, and the deposition was on its way to Santa Fe before evening. The Attorney General's office moved within the week. Voss's lawyer Whitfield was called for questioning in Santa Fe, and 2 of the men identified as financiers behind the operation were found to have additional legal complications entirely unrelated to the Sawyer land matter, the kinds of complications that make men very eager to disentangle themselves from anything that draws formal attention. Harlan Voss himself, it emerged, was not the primary force behind the operation. He was an instrument, well compensated and autonomous in his local methods, but ultimately answerable to people who were now extremely uncomfortable with the visibility the situation had acquired. When those people withdrew their support, Voss found himself standing in territory that had become legally and financially untenable, and Harlan Voss was, above all, a practical man. He came to the Sawyer ranch one last time alone on a morning in late August when the heat had broken slightly, and the sky was the high clear blue of approaching fall. He came without Doyle, without the gun, without the elaborate manner of the previous visits. He came in a plain way, like a man conducting ordinary business. James met him in the yard. Anna was inside, visible through the open kitchen window, making coffee, and she did not go out because she understood that this was a moment that needed to be James's alone. She heard some of it through the window. Voss said what he had come to say, which was short. He was withdrawing the offer. He would have no further dealings with the Sawyer land. He expected the same courtesy in return, meaning he expected the legal proceedings to conclude without further attention to his personal conduct, and in exchange he would make no further claims. James said something she could not hear. Voss said something else she could not hear. And then she heard the sound of horse hooves departing, and she poured 2 cups of coffee. And when James came into the kitchen, his face was the face of a man who has set down something he has been carrying for a very long time, and is just beginning to understand what his hands feel like, empty. She put the coffee in front of him and sat across the table. He sat down heavily and wrapped both hands around the cup. The burns from the fire were healed now, leaving only the faint permanent marks that hands like his accumulated over a lifetime. He looked at them and then at her. "It's over," he said. "Mostly," she said. "Hargrove still needs to finalize the water rights petition. That should be complete by October. But Voss is done." "Voss is done," she said. He exhaled, and it was a sound she had never heard from him before, the sound of compressed time releasing. "My father would have done exactly what you did," he said. "Found the information, understood it, come riding across the territory to make sure the right people knew it at the right moment." "Your father sounds like someone I would have liked," she said. "He would have liked you," James said. He had very little patience for people who didn't use their minds, and a great deal of respect for people who did. He looked at her steadily. "He would have said you were worth keeping." The phrase landed in the room with a weight that was deliberate. Anna felt her pulse change. "That sounds," she said carefully, "like a statement with implications beyond the legal situation." "It has implications well beyond the legal situation," he said. They looked at each other across the kitchen table in the morning light, with the coffee cooling between them and the window open to the sound of the fall air moving through the grass. And Anna's heart was doing the thing it had been doing for months now, that steady, insistent thing that she had been honest with herself about even when she had been cautious with him. "I should tell you something," James said. "All right." "I have been in love with you since the night we found Eli by the creek," he said. He said it the way he said everything important, direct and without embellishment, looking at her fully. "I did not permit myself to do anything about it for a long time because I thought I had nothing to offer, no certainty about the land, no future that was not complicated. And then the land situation became this, and I had even less to offer, and I told myself to wait until it was resolved." He paused. "It is resolved." Anna looked at him for a long moment, and she let herself feel the full weight of it, because she had been disciplined about not permitting herself to feel it completely until she knew he felt it too, and now she knew, and the weight of it was extraordinary and entirely welcome. "I have been in love with you considerably longer than you think is reasonable," she said. "And I have been waiting for you to find your way to saying it in your own time, which has been, I will be honest, a lesson in patience I did not strictly require but have benefited from." Something transformed in James Sawyer's face, something fundamental and permanent. He stood up from the table and came around it, and she stood to meet him, and he put his hands on either side of her face in a way that was so careful and so deliberate that she felt it everywhere, and he looked at her as if he was reading something he had been wanting to read for a very long time and was allowing himself to do it fully at last. "I am not easy to know," he said. "I know you," she said. "You are exactly as difficult as you need to be, and every bit of the difficulty was worth it." He kissed her, and it was not a tentative thing. It was the kiss of a man who had made up his mind and was entirely certain about what he had decided, and she kissed him back with everything she had been saving, and the kitchen was full of light, and the smell of coffee, and the particular silence of a house that has been waiting to feel like a home. The fall came on golden and swift, the way it does in the high desert, turning everything to amber and copper and filling the air with a clarity that felt almost like a held note. The formal water rights petition was finalized in October, as promised, with Hargrove filing the complete documentation in Santa Fe and the Territorial Attorney General's office confirming receipt and opening a formal public record of the spring's status as a protected natural resource. The Sawyer land was not going anywhere, and the water beneath it was formally recognized as a matter of public interest that prevented any private acquisition without territorial oversight. James read the confirmation letter 3 times. He folded it and put it in the same box where he kept his father's land grant from 1862, and he told Anna about this one evening, and she understood that the placement was the most significant thing about the act. They had not yet made formal arrangements between them, because both of them were people who moved at their own rhythm and preferred to come to things completely rather than prematurely. But the arrangement was understood by everyone in Caldwell Crossing, which in a community of 43 people meant it was understood immediately and completely, and discussed at length in the general store, at the saloon, after church, and at the schoolhouse gate when parents came to collect their children. Mrs. Crane had said nothing directly to either of them, but she had begun including an extra chair at her supper table on Sunday evenings, placed next to Anna's chair, which was occupied by James without comment or ceremony every week from mid-September onward. The schoolchildren were the most direct, as children always are. A girl named Louisa, who was 11 and possessed of her generation's particular unfiltered clarity, had asked Anna outright one morning whether she was going to marry Mr. Sawyer, and the class had gone very still in the way children go still when adult information is imminent. Anna had looked at the room full of expectant faces and said, "That is a private matter, Louisa," which answered nothing, and which Louisa correctly interpreted as a yes. James had come to speak to Anna's de facto guardian, which was Mrs. Crane, on a Thursday afternoon in November, and this conversation had lasted approximately 2 hours and had produced, as far as Anna could determine from Mrs. Crane's expression afterward, an outcome that satisfied both parties. Mrs. Crane told Anna simply that she had spoken with James and found him entirely suitable, which from Polly Crane was approximately equivalent to a full endorsement from the governor. James came to Anna on a Friday evening when the first proper cold had arrived, and the fire in the schoolhouse stove was throwing warm light across the room where she was still working at her desk, and he sat across from her in one of the student chairs, which was somewhat too small for him, and he said, without any elaborate approach, that he would like to marry her if she was willing, and that he understood if she needed time to consider, and that he wanted her to know that he was asking not because the land was secured or because the situation had resolved, but because he had been certain about wanting to marry her since long before any of that, and the resolution of the situation was simply what had finally made it possible. She had said yes before he finished. He had raised an eyebrow. She had said she had been ready to say yes for longer than she was comfortable admitting, and that she had been waiting only for him to ask. He had smiled then, fully, genuinely, the smile she had seen only a handful of times, and that still caught her off guard with its effect, and he had taken her hand across the too small desk in the lamplight and held it, and she had held his back. They were married in December, in the church that still had no minister, by Judge Metcalf, who had come for his quarterly visit and seemed genuinely pleased to have a reason to exercise the civil dimension of his authority. The entire population of Caldwell Crossing attended, because in a town of 43 people there were no private events. Mrs. Crane stood next to Anna with the bearing of a woman who has arranged things exactly as they should be. Hargrove had made the journey from Santa Fe and sat in the back row looking both satisfied and slightly sentimental, which suited him. The ceremony was simple and direct, which suited both of them, and the vows were the standard ones, which felt entirely sufficient. James said them in the voice she knew, the serious and complete voice, and she felt each word settle somewhere in her that would not be moved by anything. Afterward there was a supper at Mrs. Crane's, which had expanded into the street because the weather was dry and clear and cold, and the night sky above Caldwell Crossing was the kind of sky that only exists at high altitude, absolute with stars, the Milky Way visible as something almost substantial, as if you could put your hand into it. James stood beside Anna in the yard, and she leaned against him in the way she had been allowed to lean against him for the first time only recently, and found that she had wanted to do it for much longer than she had been aware of. He put his arm around her, and they stood and looked at the sky, and he said something she had not expected. "My father used to say that if you built something worth keeping, the land would remember it," he said. "That the memory would be in the soil and the stone and the water, and that what you built would outlast you and carry your name without your needing to say it." She turned and looked at him. "I think he was right," he said. "And I think he meant for you to be part of what gets remembered." She was quiet for a moment, feeling the full depth of what he was saying, that she was not merely marrying a man but entering into an ongoing act of creation and preservation, that what his father had begun and what James had continued was now also hers to carry and extend. "Then we should make sure we build something worth the memory," she said. He held her closer against the cold, and above them the stars continued their ancient and indifferent burning, and the night was large and the world was wide, and both of them knew exactly where they were in it. The first winter as a married couple was the kind of winter that tests the truth of what you know about another person, not dramatically but relentlessly, because the small frictions of shared space and shared rhythm and differing habits are the actual material of a life, and you find out quickly who you actually are when the novelty has settled and the practical daily reality begins. What Anna found was that James was, in the domestic sense, almost entirely self-sufficient, because he had been living alone for years, and that this self-sufficiency was not impenetrable but required gentle negotiation. He had very specific ways of doing things, and most of them were entirely reasonable, and the rest of them she addressed with the directness that he had identified as simultaneously alarming and essential, and he adjusted without drama, because he was a man who, once he understood what was needed, committed to it fully. What James found was that Anna organized the kitchen along an entirely different logic than his, that she read for long periods at hours, he considered unreasonable for a person who had been teaching all day, and that she had opinions about the house that she expressed as suggestions, but which both of them understood were decisions waiting to happen. He found that he did not mind any of this, which surprised him considerably, because he had believed himself to be someone who required a great deal of solitude, and found that while he still required some, he required considerably less than he had thought, and that the solitude he had previously maintained had been, in significant part, a form of grief management that he no longer needed to practice in the same way. She moved her books into the house in January, which required 2 trips and a reorganization of the study, which had been a room of pure function and became, under her influence, a room of function and character, with a reading chair beside the window and a lamp positioned correctly, and a small botanical drawing she had kept from Connecticut hung on the wall. James looked at the drawing for a long moment and said nothing, and then he said he thought the room looked better, and she knew from the way he said it that he meant it fully. Spring came with the particular urgency of spring in the high desert, fast and transformative, the dry ground going green almost overnight after the first real rain, and the cattle responding with the instinctive animation of animals that understand seasonal change. James was outside from before sunrise to after dark during the cattle season, and Anna taught her school days and came home to a house that smelled of dinner. She was increasingly learning to cook in the style, the altitude, and the ingredients required, which was quite different from New England cooking and required some significant adjustment. There was a hired hand now, a young man named Pete who was 17 and earnest, and who worshipped James with the open unself-consciousness of a boy who needs a reliable older example. And James treated him with the same patient precision he applied to everything, neither warm nor cold but steady and clear and consistent, which was exactly what Pete needed and what he recognized even if he could not have named it. Anna taught Pete to read properly in the evenings, with the same quiet determination she brought to everything, and James observed this from across the kitchen with an expression that told her it was one of the things he found most worth watching. In the summer of 1883, Anna became pregnant, and the news arrived with the particular combination of certainty and staggering weight that attends the realization that a life is genuinely about to change in a way that cannot be undone or modified. James received the news with a stillness that she had learned to read accurately. He was not unmoved. He was very moved, and the movement was going through layers that the surface was not yet showing. He sat for a long moment, and then he said, "A child." "Yes," she said. "On this land," he said. "On this land," she confirmed. He reached across and took her hand. He held it for a long time and said nothing, and she understood perfectly what the silence contained, which was everything his father had hoped for, and everything he himself had worked toward, the continuation of the thing, the next layer of the memory his father had said the land would carry. Hargrove wrote from Santa Fe with congratulations that summer, having heard through the reliable Frontier network of correspondence, and with a practical note informing James that he had completed the registration of the water rights such that they were now formally linked to the land title in perpetuity, meaning that any future sale or transfer of the property would automatically include and protect the water rights, which could not be separately sold. It was the final legal knot tied on the whole business, and it arrived at a moment when the meaning of permanence was already very present in the house. The birth happened in February of 1884, attended by the midwife from the settlement 15 miles south, a formidable woman named Mrs. Aldgate, who had presided over the arrival of a significant percentage of the children in the county, and who regarded childbirth with the brisk professionalism of someone who has made peace with all its variations. James was not in the room, because that was not the custom, but he was in the kitchen making coffee in quantities that far exceeded any possible need for coffee, and Pete was in the barn doing unnecessary tasks, and Mrs. Crane was in the parlor knitting with focused determination, and the house was full of the particular tension of waiting. The child was a boy, born healthy and loudly announcing himself, and he was placed in Anna's arms, and she held him and looked at his furious and perfect face, and felt the love hit her with an absolute force that reorganized everything in her instantly. All her priorities, all her perceptions, all her understanding of what mattered most. James came in when Mrs. Aldgate permitted it, and he stood at the bedside and looked at the child in the careful way he looked at things that carried enormous importance, reading every detail, and his face was doing something she had never seen it do before, had not known it was capable of doing. His eyes were bright in a way that had nothing to do with restraint. "He looks angry," James said. "He is," Anna said. "He was very comfortable." James reached out and put one finger in the baby's fist, and the baby's hand closed on it with the automatic fierceness of newborns, and James looked at that small grip for a long time. They named him Thomas, after his grandfather, and Mrs. Crane, when she was brought in to see the child, said it was exactly right, and pressed her handkerchief to her eyes briefly, and then recovered her composure in approximately 4 seconds and began making practical arrangements for the household meals during Anna's recovery. Thomas Sawyer grew in the particular way of children who are loved and outdoors and fed properly, fast and sturdy, with his father's dark eyes and his mother's particular concentration when something interested him. And the ranch became the world of his earliest understanding, the smell of horses and grass and rain and cooking, the sound of the creek and the cattle and his father's voice doing the quiet, steady work of instruction, the feel of red soil and creek water, and the rough bark of the trees along the north fence. James began talking to Thomas about the land before the boy could properly respond, walking the property with the child on his hip, and narrating it the way his own father had narrated it to him. The water sources, the soil types, the seasonal patterns, the history embedded in each corner. Anna watched this from nearby, sometimes riding alongside, sometimes simply watching from a fence rail, and the image of James holding his son against the light of the valley and speaking to him as if he were already capable of understanding every word was one she carried with her as a thing of specific and private beauty. She had resumed teaching after a few months, with Thomas initially brought to the schoolhouse, and then, as the school year progressed, left in the mornings with Pete's sister, a competent young woman named Rosa who had agreed to come 3 days a week. The children of Caldwell Crossing had grown in number, the town itself slowly expanding as the railway route decisions eventually produced a small commercial depot 4 miles east that drew new residents, and the schoolhouse population had nearly doubled by 1885, a fact that Anna brought to the attention of the town committee with her usual combination of evidence and insistence, until a proper 2-room schoolhouse was approved and constructed. In the fall of 1885, another letter arrived from Hargrove, this one regarding an inquiry from the territorial government itself about the possibility of formalizing the Sawyer Spring as a public water source under cooperative management, an arrangement in which the Sawyer family would retain ownership of the land and receive compensation for water access, while the territory would maintain and protect the water source as part of the public infrastructure. Hargrove's letter included a summary of the financial terms, which were substantial, and his assessment, which was that it was fair, and his recommendation, which was to accept. James and Anna read the letter together at the kitchen table on an evening when Thomas was asleep and the house was quiet and the fire was burning low. "This is what my father built it for," James said. "Not just for us, for the territory." "He knew," Anna said. "He built something that would outlast him and serve more than just himself. Like you said at the campsite. Like you felt long before you had the words for it," she said. He looked at the letter. "I want to accept it," he said. "But on one condition, the formal record should show the history. Thomas Sawyer, 1862, the original claim, everything that came after." "I can write that," she said. "I know," he said. "I have been counting on that." She wrote it. The formal submission to the territorial government included a 5-page historical record of the land's settlement and development, the first winter in the tent, the $40 and the horse, the barn built before the house, the spring that Thomas Sawyer had known about and protected and never sold. It was precise and it was moving, and Hargrove forwarded it with a note saying he had read it twice and found it the finest piece of documentary prose he had encountered in 30 years of legal practice. The agreement was signed in the spring of 1886, and the ceremony, such as it was, happened in the yard of the Sawyer Ranch with the territorial representative and Judge Metcalf and Hargrove and Mrs. Crane and Pete and Rosa and Thomas, who was 2.5 and not interested in the ceremony, but extremely interested in the horses the visitors had brought. Anna stood beside James while the documents were signed, and afterward, when the visitors had gone inside for supper, he stood in the yard for a moment alone, and she came and stood with him, and they looked out over the pasture and the mountains, which were wearing their spring color, the deep green of the foothills and the late snow still on the peaks. And the sky was doing the extraordinary thing it always did in this valley at this hour, turning every color at once. amber and rose and the deep violet that preceded night. He would have approved, James said. He would have been proud, she said, of all of it. James put his arm around her, and she leaned into him, and the valley held them both in the way it had held everything else it had been given, the grief and the labor and the love and the children, all of it going into the soil and the stone and the water, becoming part of the permanent record that the land kept in its own language. By 1887, Caldwell Crossing had grown to just over 100 residents, and there was a proper church with a minister, and a doctor had come from Taos and set up a practice, and the school was fully established with Anna at its head, and a young assistant teacher from Albuquerque named Clara who was excellent with the younger children. The town had acquired the character of a real community, with the interconnected dependencies and loyalties and minor conflicts of a place that has decided to last. The Sawyer Ranch had expanded modestly, with James taking on additional cattle and 2 permanent hired hands, and the property was maintained with the same careful attention that had always defined it, nothing neglected, everything understood in its relationship to everything else. In the summer of 1887, Anna told James she was pregnant again, and this time the news arrived with a different quality of feeling, not the staggering shock of the first but a deep and expansive warmth, a return of something already known and wanted. The second child, born in the early spring of 1888, was a girl, and Anna named her Helen after her own mother, and James did not object to this. He had been expecting it, had known in the way he knew most things about Anna that this was coming, and he held the girl with the same careful attention he had given everything important, and found that she had his capacity for complete stillness. Lying in his arms with her dark eyes open and perfectly calm while Thomas stood on his toes to see over the edge of the blanket. "What is she doing?" Thomas asked. "Looking at you," James said. Thomas stared back at his sister with the philosophical resignation of a child who has just realized his life has permanently changed. "She is very small," he said. "You were smaller," James said. Thomas considered this. "She smells funny," he said. "Thomas," Anna said from the bed. "She does smell a little funny," James confirmed quietly, and Anna made a sound that was the precursor to laughter, and was also something like love expressed as relief that she had built a life with a man who could make her want to laugh even in the first hours after giving birth. The years settled into themselves the way good years do, not without difficulty, because no life in the territory was without difficulty. The dry summers and the cattle prices and the occasional hard winter, and the endless practical work of maintaining both the ranch and the school. But the difficulty was manageable, and the difficulty was shared, and shared difficulty between 2 people who have chosen each other with their full understanding of each other's nature is a very different thing from difficulty endured alone. James became, in the way of men who have found their proper place, more fully himself as the years went on. The guardedness did not vanish. It was too much a part of his nature for that. But it became something chosen rather than defensive, a preference for depth over breadth in all things, for attending fully to fewer things rather than partially to many. He was known in the community as a reliable man, the kind whose word was final and whose presence in any difficulty was steadying, and Anna was known as a woman of formidable mind and warm heart, and together they were the kind of couple that anchors a community without quite meaning to. Thomas grew into his father's silence and his mother's curiosity, a quiet boy who read everything available and spent hours with James learning the land with the same intimacy James himself had learned it. By the time he was 7, he could read the water sources and the soil the way you read familiar text. He would stand in the pasture and explain to Helen, who was 5 and skeptical of everything, why the grass grew differently in this section than that one, and Helen would listen with one eyebrow raised in a way that was so precisely Anna that it made James smile every time he saw it. On a September evening in 1891, James and Anna sat on the porch in the cooling air, the same porch where nothing and everything had happened over the years, and the valley was doing its evening display. And Thomas and Helen were inside arguing about something that had the specific intensity of a disagreement between siblings who are also each other's primary company, and the sound of it was not unpleasant from a distance. James was quiet in his evening way, and Anna was reading, and the silence between them was the deep familiar kind, the kind that has been inhabited so long it has become its own form of conversation. "You know what I've been thinking about," James said. She looked up. "The north fence," she said, "and whether Pete's assessment of the herd count is accurate." He gave her the look he gave her when she was right in ways that still caught him off guard after 9 years. "Yes," he said, "and something else. Tell me." "My father's campsite," he said. "I want to take the children there this fall before it gets cold. Tell them what he told me." Anna set down her book. "Yes," she said, "that's exactly right." He nodded. "And I want you there," he said. "It should be all of us." She looked at him in the evening light. This man she had ridden 11 miles to help. This man who had held his father's land through grief and pressure and uncertainty. This man who had let her past every wall he had ever built and had never once, not once in 9 years, made her feel anything other than entirely necessary. "I'll always be there," she said. He held out his hand, and she took it, and they sat together on the porch in the September evening, while the valley held its colors for as long as it could before the dark came. And inside the house, their children argued with the full-throated conviction of children who know they are safe. And the mountains were exactly where they had always been, and the spring ran cold and clear between its red rocks, and the land remembered everything, exactly as Thomas Sawyer the elder had promised it would. In the fall, they made the trip to the campsite, the 4 of them on horseback, with the aspen turning golden along the ridgeline and the air sharp and clean, and full of the particular clarity of October at elevation. Thomas rode his own horse now, competently, with James's ease beginning to appear in the way he held his shoulders. Helen rode in front of Anna, a fierce little rider already impatient with the constraint of sharing a saddle. They came to the clearing in the late morning, when the light was full and even, and James dismounted and stood at the edge of the fire ring with the old stones still holding their circle, and the children came to stand beside him, Thomas on his left and Helen on his right, and Anna stood behind them. James looked at the fire ring for a long moment, the same long moment she had watched him give it that first time they came together, and then he crouched down so he was at the children's level, and he began to tell the story. He told it the way his father had told it, from the beginning. The man who came from Missouri with $40 and a horse. The first winter in a tent right here, in this clearing. The cold that came down from the mountains and the wolves that circled in the dark. The neighbors who came across the valley to help build. The barn before the house, because you take care of your animals first. The spring he found, cold and clear between the red rocks, and what he understood about it. He told them about the land grant and the soil and the cattle and the summers and the winters and the work that went into making something from nothing. He told them about the men who tried to take it and why it was worth keeping. He told them about the water beneath the ground and why their grandfather had chosen this valley and what it had meant to protect it. Thomas listened with his whole self in the way his father listened to everything. Helen held very still, which was not her natural state, and Anna understood that the story was doing something to her, getting into her the way certain things get into children at the exact right age. When James finished, the clearing was quiet except for the horses and the wind in the aspens. "He never sold," Thomas said. "It was not a question." "Never," James said. "Because he loved it," Helen said, with the certainty of a child who has understood the essential thing and is stating it purely. "Because he loved it," James confirmed. "And because he built something worth keeping, and because he understood that the land would take care of us if we took care of it." He looked at them both. "And it has." Anna came forward and put her hand on James's shoulder, and he put his hand over hers, and the 4 of them stood together at the old fire ring in the October light, the grandfather's story moving through the ground beneath their feet and through the water that ran cold and clear half a mile east and through the air around them, carrying itself forward the way stories carry themselves when they have been kept faithfully, into the people who will keep them next. "Can we light a fire?" Thomas asked. "In the ring." James looked at Anna. She raised her eyebrows, meaning it was his decision. He considered for a moment, looking at the stones his father had placed. "Yes," he said. "I think we should." They gathered wood together, the four of them, from the edge of the clearing, and James built the fire in the ring the way he had been taught, careful and efficient. And when it caught and the smoke rose straight up into the cold, bright air, Helen leaned back against Anna with a satisfaction that was almost philosophical, and Thomas sat beside his father with his knees pulled up and his eyes on the fire, and James looked into the flames with an expression that was at peace in the most complete sense of the phrase. A man who has done what was necessary and built what was worth building and kept faith with the people who came before him and the people who would come after. Anna looked at the fire and at her husband and her children, and at the old stones that held the memory of the first man who had stopped here and decided to stay, and she felt the fullness of the life she had come to. 11 miles of July heat, and 3 months of Saturday riding lessons, and 1 confrontation with a gun in the yard. This life that had been worth every step of the arriving at it. The fire burned through the afternoon, and they ate what they had brought, bread and dried meat and apples from the ranch's small orchard. And the children talked and fell silent and talked again in the way children do, when the day has been the right kind of long. And eventually the light began to go, and they banked the fire carefully and rode home through the dusk with the mountains dark against a sky that was doing its brilliant final performance, purple and rose, and the first stars appearing over the eastern ridge. James rode beside Anna on the way home, the children ahead of them on the trail, their voices coming back small and clear in the cooling air. "Thank you," he said. She looked at him. "For riding those 11 miles, he said. "For stepping between me and that gun, for understanding before I could explain it." He paused. "For all of it. You would have found your way," she said. "Maybe," he said, "but not as quickly, and not as well, and not with anywhere near as much to come home to." She reached across and took his hand, and they rode the last mile home in the settling dark, hand in hand, the ranch lights appearing ahead of them warm and steady, the creek sound coming up from the east, the land holding them both in its particular patient memory, and everything that had been built was still standing, and everything that had been loved was present, and nothing worth keeping had been lost. The spring went on running, cold and clear between its red rocks, exactly as it always had, serving the land and the water and the lives built above it, remembering everything in the way the land remembers everything, silently and permanently and well.